In this lecture, we will look at Gresham Sykes and David Matza's theory of the techniques of neutralization. Sykes and Matza were critical of social learning theories that argued that young people who engaged in delinquency did so because they learned definitions of crime that were held by people who were participating in delinquent subcultures. And in justifying their disagreement, they pointed to evidence that most people experience what they called maturational reform. And basically, this just means that most people age out of crime as they hit young adulthood. And they also found during interviews that even delinquent youth typically held very normative views of acceptable behavior. How does this work? Sykes and Matza argued that we can engage in delinquency even if it violates our beliefs about proper behavior because we develop justifications for our behavior. Sykes and Matza argue that young people use a set of excuses or what they call techniques of neutralization to justify delinquent acts. The techniques of neutralization can be used before delinquent behavior occurs, right? So to make the would-be offender feel less guilty or less afraid, or they can be used after the delinquent behavior, right? So to make you feel better about having done something, right? You feel less guilty. The techniques of neutralization are important because they enable individuals to participate in delinquency without actually being committed to delinquency. So you can participate in delinquency but not develop a delinquent identity. For example, an offender might believe that the circumstances surrounding a particular event are exceptional. And delinquency, even in very tough circumstances, isn't inevitable. Sykes and Matza argue that whether or not delinquency occurs depends at least in part on the individual's ability to neutralize the impact of the delinquency. Let's look at some of these techniques of neutralization. Right? Denial of responsibility is pretty common. This is where you argue that forces beyond your control made you break the law. We all use these a lot in our daily lives as well. Right? I have a similar excuse for eating chocolate chip cookies, right, and breaking my diet. Right? I just had a really rough day. This is only going to happen once this week. Right? It's denial of responsibility. Often people who engage in delinquency use denial of injury as a way to excuse their actions. Nobody was hurt. They have insurance. It was a prank. Another technique is condemnation of the condemners. This is the idea that it's okay to break the law because, all people are on the take. They're corrupt. So why shouldn't you get yours? And the last technique of neutralization is appeal to higher loyalties. Well, I didn't really do this for myself. I did it for the group. If I didn't get in a fight and stand up along with my friends, we would all lose face. And then, we'd all look really bad. So I did it for the group. It's really important to remember that techniques of neutralization make it easier to engage in delinquency. You're not bad because there was something very special about the situation that made your actions okay. Right? So techniques of neutralization don't cause delinquency. What they do is make it easier to engage in delinquency. Here's an example of the use of techniques of neutralization. And it's this really interesting study. Mohammed and Fitzwald conducted a study they entitled Dorm Room Dealers. They spent 6 years studying college students who were attending colleges and universities in Southern California. All of these students had middle class or upper class backgrounds, and the vast majority of them were white and also male. I think they had 2 women in the sample and 1 or 2 young men of color. Now, these students were dealing significant amounts of drugs, right? So they're dealing marijuana, some ecstasy, cocaine. They were very open about what they were doing. They were so, what's the word? They were so confident that they were selling product from their dorm rooms and from their houses. They would do things like speed and drive like idiots when they were moving drugs from Mexico, right, to their college or university. They weren't really concealing anything. Unbelievably, right, the colleges and universities that these folks attended weren't paying attention. Right? They were sort of hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, right, about these students and their activities. And Mohammed and Fritzwald argue that the students' race, right, because the majority of them were white, really covered for their identity, for their activities. Right? These students being white and middle class or upper middle class didn't match the image that we generally have of drug dealers. Now, when Mohammed and Fritzwald interviewed these students, they found that the students would get very upset if the term drug dealer or drug dealing was used in relationship to their daily activities. Most of these students were also in the business program. They very clearly told Mohammed and Fritzwald that they were business people. Right? I'm not a drug dealer. I'm a business person who's meeting a demand. If I don't meet the demand, somebody else is going to do it, so I might as well do it and make some money at it. This is a really good example of the denial of responsibility. All but one of the young people who Mohammed and Fritzwald interviewed stopped selling drugs after they graduated and moved into their careers. The one person who didn't stop selling drugs got way too big for his britches, and he started selling large amounts of drugs, and he was caught. Right? It was so apparent, there was no way he could fly under the radar anymore. Right? But this is a perfect example of the use of techniques of neutralization. In later work, Matza introduced another contributing factor to delinquency. And this is drift. And drift takes into account the reactions of parents, police, and other authority figures. Matza argues that those young people who are participating in delinquency, they're not really any more committed to delinquency than to conventional activities. But this doesn't just happen. He argues there are a couple of things that have to happen in order for this young person to engage in delinquency. These are what Matza calls triggering factors. First, there's a process called preparation, in which the young person comes to realize that, wait a minute, I can do this thing. And I'm probably not going to experience significant consequences. This happens as the young person's techniques of neutralization intersect with the ideologies and actions of the authorities who represent the official moral order. Authorities often excuse violations by accepting explanations that defend infractions. So they argue that delinquent behavior is something like sowing wild oats or it's kid stuff. The authorities blame the victim. They might blame the individual's parents. Right? This leads to a qualification of norms that eventually leads to an erosion of the power of the norms through these excuses and vacillation. This makes the norms appear to be less important. Right? So when I was in high school, we had a guy, I don't know if he was co-captain of the basketball team, but basketball was really important in my high school. This kid would beat his girlfriend in the halls. She would come to class with a black eye. She would be crying. Like, the teachers would know. Nobody did anything, right? Because he was the the co-captain, right, or something like that of the basketball team, and they really wanted to go to the championships. So nothing was done. What this did is it weakened the norms, right, surrounding intimate partner violence. Right? It was okay now for people to hit their girlfriend in the halls. Right? There's also another factor that we can refer to as desperation. Desperation is a deep feeling of fatalism that leads young people to try to assert their own individuality by committing acts of deviance. As most young people get older, right, they're able to exercise more agency. They can participate in independent activities that allow them to express themselves more freely, right, and allow them to be individuals. So what happens is as they become independent, they don't really need to rely on delinquency anymore. And Matza argues that this helps young people to be able to age out of crime. So this has been an introduction to the concept of the techniques of neutralization and also Matza's concept of drift.